At 62 years old, Margaret Lawson believed she finally understood the price of independence. She had spent 4 decades building a life that was stable, respectable, and entirely her own. It had not come from inheritance or luck. It had come from discipline, long nights, and decisions that many people would have been too afraid to make. What Margaret did not know yet was that the most dangerous challenge she would ever face would not come from business competitors or economic downturns. It would come disguised as companionship. Margaret lived in Portland, Oregon, in a modest but elegant home that overlooked a quiet stretch of the Willamette River. The neighborhood was peaceful, lined with old maple trees and houses built long before technology companies had turned the city into an economic hotspot. Her home was not extravagant, but everything about it reflected careful choices: the restored hardwood floors, the custom-built shelves in her study, the wide windows that let afternoon light spill across the living room. She had earned every inch of it. 30 years earlier, Margaret's life looked very different. At 34, she was recently divorced, raising a 12-year-old daughter on her own, and working as a junior operations coordinator at a regional produce distribution company. The job was exhausting and often thankless. Trucks arrived late, shipments spoiled, suppliers argued over contracts, and supervisors rarely trusted her judgment. The logistics industry was dominated by men who believed women should stay behind desks, not run complicated delivery networks. Margaret learned quickly that being underestimated could be an advantage. While others dismissed her, she studied every part of the system. She learned fuel pricing, warehouse management, supplier contracts, and refrigeration technology. She memorized delivery routes across Oregon and Washington. She asked questions that annoyed managers, but gave her answers no one else bothered to understand. Within 5 years, she had saved enough money to take a risk. She leased a small refrigerated warehouse outside Portland and bought a single-use transport truck. It was not glamorous work. Margaret handled invoices during the day, negotiated supplier agreements at night, and sometimes drove deliveries herself when drivers canceled. During peak harvest seasons, she slept on a narrow couch in her office, waking before dawn to check loading schedules. Those years demanded sacrifices most people never saw. There were months when Margaret delayed paying her own bills just to make sure employee salaries cleared on time. There were contracts that nearly bankrupted her when farmers failed to deliver promised crops. There were nights when she sat alone in her office staring at spreadsheets, wondering if she had made the biggest mistake of her life. But she refused to quit. Gradually, her reputation grew. Local farmers trusted her because she honored contracts even when profits were thin. Grocery chains appreciated her reliability. Drivers preferred working for her because she paid fairly and treated them with respect. Word spread that Margaret Lawson's company did not miss deliveries. By the time she turned 50, her small operation had expanded into 3 distribution centers across Oregon and Northern California. Her company handled refrigerated logistics for regional farms, specialty grocers, and food cooperatives. It was not a flashy business. It did not attract headlines or venture capital, but it worked. Food moved across the region every day because Margaret's systems were precise and dependable. By 60, her company was financially stable. Debt had been reduced to manageable levels. Her assets included multiple warehouses, transportation contracts, and commercial property holdings tied to the business. Margaret was not wealthy in the billionaire sense, but she was secure, and she had done it entirely on her own. Her daughter, Olivia, had grown up and moved to Chicago to pursue a career in architecture. They spoke often and visited when they could, but Olivia's life had its own rhythm now. Margaret's days were still full of activity. Meetings with suppliers, warehouse inspections, contract negotiations, operational planning. Her evenings, however, were different. Quiet. Too quiet sometimes. After work, she often sat on the back deck of her house, listening to the slow movement of the river and the distant sounds of trains crossing the bridges. She told herself she enjoyed the solitude. For years she had convinced herself that independence meant not needing anyone. Yet loneliness rarely announces itself directly. It appears slowly, disguised as reflection. Then one evening in early autumn, Margaret attended a charity fundraiser she would normally have avoided. The event was organized by a regional agricultural association raising money for rural food banks. One of her longtime suppliers insisted she attend. The ballroom buzzed with polite conversation, clinking glasses, and the kind of networking that always felt slightly artificial to her. Margaret stood near the edge of the room when a man approached. He introduced himself simply. Daniel Harper. He was 67, tall, calm, and carried himself with the relaxed confidence of someone who had spent many years advising powerful people. His gray hair was neatly combed, and his voice was steady, without sounding rehearsed. "I used to help companies avoid expensive mistakes," he said with a small smile. Margaret laughed. "That sounds like a stressful profession." "It was," he replied. "That's why I retired." Their conversation lasted nearly an hour. They spoke about Portland's changing neighborhoods, about river traffic, about how complicated business regulations had become over the years. Daniel listened carefully whenever Margaret described her work. He asked thoughtful questions, but never acted as if he knew more than she did. That detail stood out. Many men Margaret had met over the years seemed intimidated by her success, or eager to compete with it. Daniel did neither. He seemed genuinely interested. Over the following weeks they met for coffee several times. Coffee turned into dinner. Dinner turned into quiet walks through the Pearl District or along the river paths. Daniel shared parts of his life gradually. He had been married once, he said. His wife had passed away several years earlier after a long illness. He had 3 adult children living nearby. They were successful, independent, and close to him. Margaret appreciated that he did not rush anything. If she canceled plans because of a warehouse emergency, Daniel never complained. Instead, he asked if everything was under control. If she mentioned a stressful contract negotiation, he listened rather than offering advice. It felt peaceful. 3 months later, one evening while they sat on her deck watching the sunset reflect across the river, Daniel asked a question. "Why didn't you ever remarry?" Margaret thought about the answer carefully. "I spent most of my life building something that needed all of my attention," she said. "There wasn't much room left for anything else." Daniel nodded slowly. "I understand that," he said. "After my wife died, I realized how easy it is to lose yourself trying to meet everyone else's expectations." The statement sounded sincere. Time passed easily between them, and eventually, quietly, Daniel suggested something Margaret had not seriously considered in decades. Marriage. There was no dramatic proposal. Just a conversation beneath the fading evening light. "I don't need anything from you," Daniel told her. "I just think life might be better if we built the next chapter together." Margaret believed him. Looking back, the moment seemed simple and harmless. But what she did not realize was that Daniel Harper had been studying her life with extraordinary patience. And while Margaret was learning to trust companionship again, Daniel was quietly learning something far more valuable: the structure of everything she owned. Margaret Lawson had spent most of her life making decisions carefully. In business, haste could destroy years of work, and she had learned long ago that patience often revealed things that urgency concealed. When Daniel Harper began speaking more seriously about marriage, Margaret approached the idea the same way she approached a major business contract: slowly, deliberately, and with quiet preparation. The first person she contacted was not her daughter or her friends. It was her attorney. Rachel Donovan had represented Margaret for nearly 15 years. She had handled property acquisitions, negotiated supplier disputes, and guided Margaret through several complicated regulatory investigations that could have cost the company millions if mishandled. Rachel knew the structure of Margaret's business better than almost anyone. When Margaret explained the situation, Rachel listened without interrupting. "So," Rachel finally said, leaning back in her chair, "you trust him?" Margaret considered the word carefully. "I like him," she replied. "He's calm, thoughtful. He doesn't seem interested in competing with what I've built." Rachel nodded slowly, but her expression remained serious. "I'm not going to tell you not to marry him," she said, "but you spent 30 years building assets most people could never manage. If you do this, you protect them." Within 2 weeks, Rachel drafted a comprehensive prenuptial agreement. The document was direct and unmistakably clear. Every asset Margaret owned prior to the marriage would remain entirely hers. Her distribution company, the warehouses, the commercial land, the equipment, the investment accounts tied to the business. None of it would become shared marital property. Daniel reviewed the agreement with his own attorney. To Margaret's surprise, he signed it without hesitation. He even laughed lightly when they finalized the paperwork. "I suppose romance and lawyers rarely appear in the same room," he joked. Margaret smiled, but something inside her felt unsettled. Not alarmed, just aware. There was a faint tension she could not quite explain. Daniel had accepted the legal boundaries easily, almost too easily. It was as if the document had not actually changed anything about his expectations. Over the following weeks, Margaret began noticing something subtle. Daniel asked questions. Not intrusive ones, not at first. He asked how long her company had existed, whether the warehouses were purchased outright or financed, how many employees worked across the distribution network. The questions sounded casual. Yet Margaret had spent decades in negotiations, and she understood patterns. Questions rarely appear randomly. They build towards something. She answered politely, but kept her responses general. When Daniel asked about ownership structures, she mentioned that her company had evolved through several legal reorganizations over the years. When he asked whether the properties were held directly by the business, she said that some assets were structured through various agreements. None of it was technically untrue. It was simply incomplete. Margaret had learned long ago that transparency and exposure were not the same thing. Daniel seemed satisfied with her answers, but the questions did not stop entirely. Sometimes they appeared in small comments. "You must have excellent advisors managing things," he said once while they were discussing business taxes. Another time he remarked, "It sounds like a complicated operation. I imagine there are multiple stakeholders involved." Margaret did not correct the assumption. Instead, she allowed the impression to remain, not because she distrusted him, but because something inside her refused to reveal the full map of what she had built. People often misunderstood that instinct when Margaret later told her story. They believed secrecy meant suspicion. But Margaret had survived in a competitive industry precisely because she understood when silence was protection. Months passed. Eventually, Margaret and Daniel married in a small ceremony outside Portland. The event was simple: a quiet chapel, a handful of close friends, and a dinner afterward at a nearby restaurant overlooking the river. It felt peaceful. Margaret believed she had found a companion who respected her independence. 3 weeks later, Daniel introduced her to his children. They arrived at Margaret's house on a Sunday afternoon. The first to arrive was Daniel's eldest daughter, Emily Harper. She worked in commercial real estate development and carried herself with the confident posture of someone used to evaluating property values quickly. Emily greeted Margaret warmly, complimented the house, and within minutes began observing details around the room. "The ceiling height is impressive," she said, glancing upward. "And the neighborhood has been appreciating quickly, hasn't it?" Margaret smiled politely. "Yes, it has grown quite a bit over the years." Soon Daniel's son arrived. Nathan Harper worked as a financial consultant in Portland. He was polite and well-dressed, and he spent most of the afternoon quietly observing Margaret's home office when he thought no one was watching. He eventually joined Margaret in the kitchen. "You must manage a lot of contracts," he said casually. "Distribution logistics can get complicated." "It keeps me busy," Margaret replied. "How diversified are your supplier agreements?" Nathan asked. "Do you rely heavily on a few large producers?" The question surprised her slightly. Most people outside the industry did not understand enough about distribution networks to ask that. Margaret answered with a brief explanation but avoided specifics. The final arrival was Daniel's youngest daughter, Claire. Claire spoke the least during the visit. She smiled frequently, listened carefully, and observed conversations with quiet attention. Yet when she did ask questions, they were remarkably precise. At dinner she looked at Margaret thoughtfully. "Have you thought about succession planning for your company?" she asked. The question hung in the air. Margaret took a sip of water before answering. "It's something I review occasionally. Is the business expected to remain within the family?" Claire continued gently. Margaret kept her voice calm. "The company will continue operating as long as it serves its purpose." Daniel sat quietly during the conversation. That detail unsettled Margaret more than the questions themselves. He did not redirect the discussion. He did not discourage the topic. Instead, he watched silently, occasionally smiling as if the conversation were entirely natural. Over the next several weeks, the visits continued, and the questions gradually evolved. Emily asked whether Margaret had updated insurance valuations on the warehouse properties recently. Nathan wondered aloud if the company had ever considered restructuring ownership to improve tax efficiency. Claire asked whether Margaret had a formal will in place. Not privately. At the dinner table, Margaret answered carefully each time. Always polite. Always vague. One morning several weeks later, Daniel placed a folder on the kitchen counter while Margaret was reviewing shipping reports. "Just routine paperwork," he said casually. Margaret opened the folder. Several documents were exactly what Daniel claimed: beneficiary forms, emergency contact authorizations, standard legal updates couples sometimes arrange after marriage. But 2 documents were different. They granted broad financial authority, not limited oversight. Full authorization to act on Margaret's behalf in certain financial matters. Margaret closed the folder slowly and slid it back toward him. "I'm not signing these," she said calmly. Daniel laughed lightly, but the sound felt forced. "You don't trust me?" Margaret met his eyes. "I trust myself," she replied. The silence that followed was heavy. Daniel did not argue. He did not raise his voice. Instead, he withdrew. Over the following days, he became distant. Short answers. Less conversation. A polite but noticeable coldness. Soon afterward, the phone calls began. Daniel often stepped outside to take them. The conversations were long, quiet, and always just beyond hearing distance. When Margaret asked who had called, his answers were brief. "Work contacts. Just one of the kids." Margaret tried not to assume the worst, but something about the situation felt wrong. Small things began to appear. A filing cabinet drawer slightly open in her office. Documents not exactly where she remembered leaving them. An employee asking about a policy change Margaret had never authorized. None of the incidents were dramatic. Individually, they meant nothing. But together they formed a pattern Margaret had seen before in business negotiations. Someone was studying her operation. Quietly. Systematically. By the end of the year, Margaret realized something she had not wanted to admit. This was no longer about marriage. It was about access. And somewhere, someone was beginning to calculate exactly how valuable her life's work might be. The first real warning did not come as a confrontation or an obvious betrayal. It came quietly, almost accidentally, in the form of a phone call late on a Tuesday evening. Margaret Lawson had just returned home from one of her distribution centers outside Salem. It had been a long day dealing with a refrigeration malfunction that threatened to spoil an entire shipment of produce. She was standing in her kitchen, reheating leftover soup, when her phone rang. The call was from Daniel's logistics coordinator at the Portland office, a man named Victor Hale, who had worked with Margaret for nearly 12 years. Victor was not the type of person who called late unless something was truly unusual. His voice sounded cautious. "Margaret, I didn't want to alarm you," he began, "but something strange happened today." Margaret leaned against the kitchen counter, immediately attentive. "What kind of strange?" "There was a call to our compliance desk this afternoon," Victor said. "Someone asking about ownership filings for the company." Margaret frowned slightly. What exactly did they ask? They wanted to know if any changes were expected in the company's ownership structure this quarter. They were also asking about property registration records tied to the warehouse properties. Margaret felt a faint tightening in her chest. Did they say who they were? Victor hesitated. "They said they were calling on behalf of your family." After the call ended, Margaret remained in the kitchen for several minutes, staring at the dark reflection in the window above the sink. The house was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator. Family. The word lingered in her mind. She had not authorized anyone to inquire about corporate ownership. The next morning, she contacted Rachel Donovan and asked her to quietly review any recent public filings connected to Margaret's business entities and property records. Margaret specifically requested that the review remain discreet. She did not want any notifications sent that might alert someone to the investigation. 3 days later, Rachel called her. Her voice carried a seriousness Margaret had learned to recognize over the years. "Margaret," Rachel said slowly, "I found something." Margaret drove directly to Rachel's office downtown. Rachel had already arranged several documents across the conference table by the time Margaret arrived. The papers looked official, stamped, filed, and recorded within the county system. Margaret sat down and studied the first page. At a glance, the document appeared to be a proposed amendment to a property ownership filing connected to one of her warehouse locations. Her name was on the document. Her signature was not. The imitation was close, but Margaret immediately recognized the difference. She had signed thousands of legal documents during her career. She knew the exact rhythm of her own handwriting. This was a forgery. Rachel placed several more papers beside the first. "There are 5 documents in total," she said. "They were submitted over the last 2 months." Margaret slowly examined each page. All of them referenced ownership adjustments, partnership acknowledgments, or proposed structural amendments related to the distribution company. None of them were complete transfers, but they were something else. The beginning of a paper trail. What exactly were they trying to do? Margaret asked quietly. Rachel folded her hands. "They weren't attempting to take full control immediately," she explained. "These filings appear designed to establish the appearance of shared ownership over time. If enough supporting documents accumulate, it becomes easier to claim legitimate interest in the assets." Margaret sat back in her chair, absorbing the implication. Someone was attempting to slowly redraw the legal boundaries of her company, without her knowledge. Without her permission. "Do we know who filed these?" Margaret asked. Rachel slid another document across the table. The submissions were made through a legal intermediary, but the authorization references family representation. Margaret did not need to ask the obvious question. She already knew the answer. Later that evening, she returned home earlier than usual. Daniel arrived about an hour later. He walked into the house casually, greeting her with the same calm demeanor he had always displayed. Margaret watched him carefully. His posture, his tone, his expression. Nothing appeared unusual, yet something inside her had shifted permanently. That night, Margaret made a decision. She would not confront him. Not yet. Confrontation would only warn them. Instead, she began documenting everything. Every conversation. Every unusual question. Every phone call Daniel stepped outside to take. Margaret also began securing her company's systems quietly. Under the explanation of routine security upgrades, she instructed her IT department to install additional monitoring protocols on company files and communications. If someone was studying her business, she intended to know exactly how. At the same time, Margaret hired a private investigator. His name was David Mercer, a former federal financial crimes investigator who specialized in corporate fraud and elder exploitation cases. When Margaret met him for the first time in a quiet cafe near the waterfront, she explained everything she knew. David listened carefully, without interrupting. When she finished, he simply nodded. "Give me 2 weeks," he said. Those 2 weeks felt longer than any Margaret could remember. At home, she continued acting normally. She remained polite with Daniel. She smiled when his children visited. She allowed casual conversations about estate planning to continue without argument. Inside, however, she was watching, waiting. 14 days later, David Mercer called and asked Margaret to meet him again. This time, he brought a thick folder. The look on his face told Margaret everything before he even spoke. "This situation," he began carefully, "is not new for them." Margaret felt a slow chill settle over her. "What do you mean?" David opened the folder. "Daniel Harper has been married twice before you." Margaret nodded. Daniel had mentioned his previous marriage briefly. "My understanding is that his wife passed away after an illness." David slid the first set of documents across the table. "His first wife was named Patricia Harper," he said. 6 months before her death, she transferred ownership of 2 commercial properties and several retirement accounts entirely into Daniel's name. Margaret read the summary. Patricia had reportedly been experiencing cognitive decline during the final year of her life. Her sister had attempted to contest the asset transfers, claiming Patricia had been manipulated while ill. The case settled quietly. Daniel kept the assets. David opened another section of the file. "His second marriage ended 5 years later," he continued. Margaret's hands tightened slightly. Her name was Susan Caldwell. She died after falling down a staircase at a vacation property in Arizona. Margaret stared at the page. 3 months before the accident, Susan had signed several documents granting Daniel extensive financial authority over her business and real estate holdings. Her adult son attempted to challenge the transfers in civil court. The lawsuit was dismissed after Daniel produced signed authorizations. David looked directly at Margaret. "In both cases," he said calmly, "the paperwork protected him." Margaret remained silent. David continued turning pages. Daniel's children appeared repeatedly throughout the records. Emails discussing financial restructuring. Messages coordinating legal consultations. Participation in meetings regarding asset management. "This isn't just Daniel," David said quietly. "It's a coordinated effort." Margaret felt something inside her shift from fear into something far colder. Clarity. "They target women with assets," David explained. "They build trust slowly. Then they wait for vulnerability, illness, age, isolation. Once legal authority is established, they move quickly." Margaret looked up. "And me?" David gave a small, grim smile. "You're different." "Why?" "Because you're healthy. Because you run an active company. And because you never fully revealed what you own." Margaret understood immediately. The illusion she had allowed Daniel to believe, that her assets were complicated and shared, had slowed them down. "They're still studying the situation," David said. Waiting for the right moment, Margaret closed the folder slowly. For several seconds she said nothing. Then she looked directly at David Mercer. "If we stop them now," she asked quietly, "can we prove intent?" David nodded. "With the forged filings and enough documentation of their planning, yes." Margaret took a deep breath. For the first time since this had begun, she felt completely certain about what she needed to do. "They think they're ahead of me," she said. David studied her expression. "What are you planning?" Margaret's voice was calm. "I'm going to let them believe they're winning." Once Margaret Lawson understood the truth, fear did not control her. It sharpened her. Years of running a business had trained her to recognize one principle that applied both in logistics and in life. When someone believed they were winning, they stopped being careful. That realization became the foundation of her plan. Margaret did not change her routine. She continued visiting her warehouses, attending meetings, reviewing contracts, and living her life exactly as she had before. At home, she remained polite, even warm toward Daniel. If anything, she seemed more relaxed than she had in months. When Daniel's children visited, Margaret no longer avoided their questions as firmly as before. She listened. Sometimes she nodded. Occasionally, she allowed a suggestion to remain unanswered instead of rejecting it immediately. The change did not go unnoticed. Daniel began smiling again the way he had early in their relationship, the calm, reassuring smile that once made Margaret feel safe. His conversations slowly shifted tone. Instead of cautious distance, he spoke again about the future. One evening while they were having dinner, Daniel casually mentioned estate planning. "You shouldn't have to carry the weight of everything alone," he said. "There comes a time when sharing responsibility becomes practical." Margaret looked thoughtful. "You might be right," she said quietly. Daniel watched her closely. For the first time in weeks, he seemed encouraged. Behind the scenes, however, Margaret was working carefully with Rachel Donovan and David Mercer. Every conversation that could legally be recorded was documented. Emails were archived. Phone logs were preserved. Security monitoring at the company quietly tracked who accessed sensitive files. They allowed the forged filings to remain exactly as they were. Rachel explained that removing them too early could weaken the case. Leaving them untouched preserved evidence of intent. Meanwhile, David continued collecting information about Daniel and his children's communications. Patterns emerged quickly. There were discussions about property valuations, legal timing, and possible restructuring strategies. They were preparing something. Margaret decided it was time to accelerate events. One afternoon, she approached Daniel with a suggestion. "I've been thinking about something," she said casually while they were sitting in the living room. Daniel looked up from his tablet. "What's that?" "I think we should have a family dinner," Margaret said. "A real one. I'd like to talk openly about the future." Daniel paused. For a moment, Margaret could almost see the calculations moving behind his expression. "That sounds like a good idea," he said finally. Margaret nodded. "Invite your children. I want them there." Daniel agreed immediately. The dinner was scheduled for 2 weeks later. During those 14 days, Margaret prepared everything with precision. Rachel Donovan would attend the dinner. So would David Mercer. But they would not be the only unexpected guests. Margaret had contacted 2 other people after David's investigation revealed Daniel's history: the sister of Daniel's first wife, and the adult son of his second. Both had lived for years with unanswered suspicions about what had happened to their loved ones. When Margaret explained the situation, they agreed to come. The evening of the dinner arrived quietly. Margaret's house looked warm and inviting. Soft lights filled the dining room. The table was set carefully, and a catered meal waited in the kitchen. Daniel's children arrived first. Emily entered with confident composure, dressed as though she were attending a professional meeting rather than a family gathering. Nathan followed shortly after, polite but observant as always. Claire arrived last, offering Margaret a warm smile. Daniel appeared pleased. Everything seemed to be unfolding exactly the way he had hoped. Rachel Donovan arrived next, greeting everyone politely as Margaret introduced her as a longtime friend and advisor. David Mercer followed shortly after. Daniel looked slightly confused, but said nothing. Then the doorbell rang again. Margaret walked calmly to answer it. When she returned to the dining room, 2 more guests stepped inside. A middle-aged woman with tired but determined eyes, and a younger man whose expression carried years of unresolved anger. Daniel's reaction was immediate. The color drained slowly from his face. For several seconds, no one spoke. Finally, Daniel found his voice. "Margaret, what is this?" Margaret moved to the head of the dining table. Her voice was steady. "This," she said, "is a conversation that should have happened years ago." Nathan stood up abruptly. "This is inappropriate," he said sharply. Margaret met his gaze calmly. "So are forged legal documents." The room fell silent. Daniel stared at her. Margaret continued speaking without raising her voice. Over the next several minutes, she explained everything. The suspicious phone call, the forged filings, the investigation, the pattern revealed in David Mercer's report. Rachel Donovan then placed copies of the documents on the table one by one. Each paper spoke clearly. Dates, signatures, recorded filings. David Mercer explained the investigative findings, describing how Daniel and his children had appeared in previous financial disputes involving Daniel's former marriages. Then Margaret stepped back. The two additional guests spoke. The sister of Patricia Harper described the months leading up to her sister's death and the sudden legal transfers that followed. The son of Susan Caldwell described the lawsuit he had attempted to file after his mother's fatal fall. Neither of them raised their voices. They simply told the truth. Daniel tried once to interrupt. "You're misunderstanding everything," he said. Margaret looked directly at him. "No," she replied calmly. "I understand perfectly." At that moment, there was a knock on the front door. Margaret had been expecting it. Two detectives from the Portland Police Bureau entered the house quietly. They did not shout. They did not rush. Rachel Donovan had already provided them with the evidence collected over the previous weeks, including the forged documents and recorded communications. The detectives spoke calmly with Daniel for a moment. Then they informed him that he was under arrest for fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and attempted financial exploitation. The room remained silent as they placed the handcuffs around his wrists. Daniel looked back at Margaret. There was no anger in his expression, only disbelief. He had assumed she was another victim. He had never imagined she was documenting everything. As the officers escorted Daniel toward the door, his children remained frozen at the table. The investigation that followed moved quickly. Once law enforcement began examining the records, the pattern became undeniable. The forged filings, the coordinated emails, the financial discussions, when viewed together, they revealed a carefully organized scheme. Daniel attempted to defend himself, but this time the documents did not support him. Facing overwhelming evidence, the case proceeded to trial within the year. Margaret testified calmly. She described the events clearly without exaggeration or emotion. She did not need to dramatize anything. The truth was already powerful enough. The jury returned a guilty verdict. Daniel received a significant prison sentence. His children faced charges related to conspiracy and financial fraud. Under legal pressure, they turned against one another, each attempting to reduce their own responsibility. Watching the process unfold brought Margaret no satisfaction, only clarity, how close she had come to losing everything. The divorce was finalized quietly. The prenuptial agreement protected every asset Margaret had built. Daniel left the marriage with nothing he had not brought into it. Margaret remained in the house overlooking the river. The company continued operating without interruption. Trucks still moved food across Oregon and California every day. Employees continued their work unaware of how close the business had come to becoming collateral damage in someone else's scheme. A year later, Margaret repainted the interior walls and replaced the locks, not because she needed to erase the past, but because she wanted to reclaim the space. Her daughter Olivia began visiting more often. Evenings returned to the quiet rhythm Margaret had once known, the sound of the river, the slow fading of sunlight across the water. But now the silence felt different. It no longer felt like loneliness. It felt like peace. Margaret never remarried, not because she rejected love, but because she had learned something far more important. Love should never require risking the life you spent decades building. And sometimes the strongest protection a person can use is patience, the quiet power of watching carefully until the truth reveals itself.